It's crazy to think, what secrets are buried right under our feet.
Mm.
Like, get this. People have figured out where political borders were 4,000 years ago in the Iberian Peninsula, all thanks to old pieces of pottery.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, right?
It really is. And this research is so interesting because it helps us understand El Argar, which is considered the first state-level society in that area.
Right. Like, how did they come to be?
Exactly. And how do they get along with all the communities around them that weren't structured the same way?
So for everyone listening, think of this deep dive as a crash course on this really cool research. We're going to break down what it tells us about how early states formed in the Bronze Age and how they dealt with their neighbors.
Sounds good.
And don't worry, we won't drown you in technical terms. We'll focus on the practical side of things, the cool ways archaeologists uncover these hidden histories.
Yeah, it's like detective work.
Totally. So where's all this info coming from?
Well, the main source is a research article that was recently published in the Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory.
Okay, cool.
And this article dives into a new analysis of pottery from the Bronze Age, specifically from the northern part of what's now the Murcia region of Spain.
Murcia, got it.
And this area was super important back then because it was basically a border zone right between El Argar and those other Bronze Age groups, the Valencian and La Mancha folks.
Makes sense. A real melting pot.
Yeah.
So, where are we headed with this deep dive? What are we trying to figure out?
Our main goal is to figure out how these ancient societies interacted, where the boundaries between them lay, both in terms of economics and politics,
Right.
and what all this tells us about how early states first appeared and developed.
Got it. So, first things first, paint us a picture of this El Argar society. They sound pretty powerful for their time.
They were pretty influential, that's for sure. El Argar was a major player in the early Bronze Age, and they really thrived between around 2200 and 1550 BCE in southeastern Iberia.
Southeastern Iberia.
Yeah. And there are some key things that really set them apart and make archaeologists classify them as an early state.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Well, first off, they had centralized political control. And we know this because we see a lot of consistency in their economic practices and even their belief systems, which spanned a huge area. In fact, their territory grew quite a bit during their time, from about 5,000 to a whopping 35,000 square kilometers.
Oh, wow. That's a huge expansion.
Hmm.
So it wasn't just about size, though, right?
Yeah.
What else makes them stand out as an early state?
You're absolutely right. Their architecture was also quite distinct. They had specific ways of building settlements, including some pretty impressive structures.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And then there are their burial customs. They were pretty standardized across their territory and often included a lot of valuable goods buried with certain individuals, but only in a limited number of graves.
Interesting. Sounds like there was some social hierarchy there.
Definitely. And finally, they had a really complex economy. They relied heavily on agriculture, especially cereal crops, and they had a pretty sophisticated metalworking industry, too.
So they were organized, skilled, and had a clear power structure.
You got it.
Now, the research mentioned something about disruptive societies. What's that all about?
Yes. Disruptive societies is a term used to describe early states that went through a period of rapid growth and development, followed by a pretty quick decline.
Like a boom and bust?
Kind of, yeah. And El Argar fits that description perfectly. We see similar patterns in other parts of Europe from the same period, like the Unitis culture in Central Europe and the Minoan civilization over in Crete.
Wow, interesting. So knowing all this about El Argar, what was the big mystery this research was trying to solve?
Well, even though we know a good deal about what was going on within El Argar, we don't really understand their relationships with their neighbors, those communities that weren't as centralized or organized. This research is all about filling that gap, especially by looking at those interactions at El Argar's edges where they met those different groups.
So it's all about the borderlands then?
Precisely. And this is where things get really interesting because borders in ancient times weren't the neat lines we see on modern maps.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Right. When we think of borders today, we picture these fixed, hard divisions. But in the past, things were much more fluid and complex. It was less about drawing lines on a map and more about how these different groups actually interacted, how they created and maintained their boundaries.
So what were they looking for if not a line on a map?
The researchers were interested in what they call bordering practices. These are the social, political, economic, and even symbolic actions that basically created and upheld those boundaries between different groups.
Okay, give me some examples.
Sure, think about things like trade. Did they exchange specific goods across these boundaries?
Makes sense.
Or what about pottery styles or burial customs? Did they adopt each other's practices, and if so, how? These are the kinds of actions that would have shaped the border.
I see. So it's about understanding those processes of interaction, not just finding a static boundary line.
Exactly. And the specific area they focused on was this border region in northern Murcia, which was a perfect place to study these dynamics.
Why is that? What made that area so special?
Well, the middle and upper Segura River Valley in northern Murcia was a key borderland because that's where El Argar met its northern neighbors. To the west, you had the La Mancha Bronze Age culture, and to the east, there was the Valencian Bronze Age culture.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Now, these neighboring cultures were quite distinct. The La Mancha groups, for example, often built fortified settlements, while the Valencian groups favored hilltop locations.
Interesting. Different strategies.
Right. So, by looking at this specific borderland, the researchers could see how El Argar, with its centralized structure, dealt with these different kinds of societies, each with its own unique characteristics.
It's like a real social experiment unfolding in the past.
Exactly. So how did they actually study these ancient borders? What did they look at?
Well, I hear pottery was a big part of it.
It was absolutely crucial. The researchers used a combination of techniques, and it's really quite clever.
Okay, lay it on me.
So they did a lot of field work, walking the landscape and surveying the area for archaeological sites.
Good old-fashioned field work.
Yeah, it's the foundation. They surveyed 71 early Bronze Age settlements and found pottery in 61 of them.
Wow, that's a lot of sites.
It is. Then they collected a bunch of pottery, being careful to pick up pieces that would give them the most information, like rims and bases, so they could get a better idea of the whole pot.
Smart.
And they didn't just randomly grab pottery, they tried to get at least 50 pieces from each site.
Okay, so 50 pieces from 61 sites.
That's a lot of pottery. In total, they analyzed over 1,600 pieces.
Wow.
Then they used a technique called pottery petrography to analyze the actual materials the pottery was made from.
Pottery petrography, that sounds pretty high-tech.
It is.
So in layman's terms, what is that?
Well, think of it this way. Just like every person has unique fingerprints, the clay in different places has its own unique fingerprint too, based on the minerals and tiny rock bits found in it.
Interesting.
So petrography is like looking at that fingerprint under a microscope.
Makes sense. So they weren't just interested in the shapes of the pots or the decorations. They were looking at the actual dirt they were made from.
You got it. Now, here's why this is so powerful. Different groups might copy each other's styles and decorations, but the clay itself usually comes from a specific place.
So you can tell where the pot was made.
Precisely. And that tells us a lot about trade, interaction, and even the movement of people in the past. It's much more reliable than just looking at the style.
Makes sense. So after all that field work and analysis, what did they learn about the pottery? And what did that tell them about these ancient borders?
Well, the petrography helped them identify 14 distinct pottery groups, which they categorized based on the clay type and all those little bits of rock and minerals.
Okay, what kind of patterns did they find?
One thing that stood out was that pottery made with local clays, which often had a lot of calcium carbonate in them, tended to be a bit lower quality. This makes sense, using what's readily available.
Right. What about the pottery they could link directly to El Argar? What was that made of?
That's where it gets really interesting. They found 3 pottery types. They labeled them PHC, PHCC, and Seif that matched pottery known to have been made in El Argar's heartland.
Okay, so they were able to match the fingerprints, so to speak.
Exactly. And these Argaric types were made with very specific clays that contained tiny bits of metamorphic rocks, like schists, and sometimes even tiny pieces of garnet.
Garnets. Fancy.
Right. But here's the thing. Those specific types of clay aren't found in the border region they studied.
Really? Where did they come from then?
The geological sources for these materials are actually located in the mountains further south, in southern Murcia and Almeria.
So how did they end up in the border region?
Well, that's the key, isn't it? And it points to a pretty well-organized system within El Argar. They were quarrying these special clays, producing pottery in a centralized way, and then transporting it over 50 kilometers to this border area. That's pretty impressive logistics for the Bronze Age.
It really is. So they weren't just making this stuff locally. It was coming from the El Argar heartland.
Exactly. And keep in mind, these specific Argaric pottery types were super common in El Argar's main settlements.
So it was like their signature style.
You could say that. Now, in the border region they studied, these Argaric types were found in about half of the sites, which made them the second most common type overall.
Still a significant presence then.
Absolutely. But here's where the distribution gets really interesting. These Argaric types were totally absent from the Altiplano region in the northeastern part of the study area.
Hmm. Okay, so maybe that's a clue about the boundaries between these groups.
Right,
Yeah.
and the highest concentration of Argaric pottery was found in the southern part of the border region, the part closest to El Argar's core territory. So already we're seeing a picture of uneven influence, maybe even a hint of where the borders might have been.
Makes sense. Was there anything else interesting about where they found or didn't find this Argaric pottery?
Yeah, actually, there was this really interesting pattern in the Middle Segura area.
What was that?
Well, they found some pottery styles and even burial practices that looked like they were influenced by El Argar, like they were copying what the Argar folks were doing.
Okay.
But here's the catch. When they analyzed the clay, they found that a lot of this pottery wasn't actually made with those distinctive Argaric clays.
Oh, so they were copying the style but not the materials.
Exactly. It seems like the local potters in this area were seeing what El Argar was doing and kind of imitating it, but they were using their own local clays to do so.
That's pretty clever, adapting the styles to their own materials.
Yeah.
What kind of Argaric shapes did they find in this area?
They mostly found storage jars, drinking cups called chalices, and bowls with those rims that curve inward, all pretty typical Argaric forms.
Cool. So we've got this pottery coming in from El Argar, but it sounds like there was also pottery being made locally in the border region itself. Did they find anything particularly widespread?
Yeah, there was one type that really stood out, which they called CCLC. It was made from a reddish clay without much calcium carbonate, and the potters had added in crushed bits of calcite or dolomite, which are types of minerals, to make it stronger when it was fired.
Ah, so that's the temper.
Exactly. And sometimes they even found tiny fragments of volcanic-like rock in this CCLEC pottery, which probably came from the Cieza region within their study area.
Interesting. So where was this CCL Lake pottery found?
It was all over the place. It was spread out across most of the middle and upper Segura Valley, basically everywhere except the southwestern part.
Really widespread then.
Yeah, but the highest concentration was found around the town of Calispera, which suggests that this might have been a major production center for this type of pottery.
Makes sense. So if it was mostly made around Calispera, why was it found in so many other places?
Good question. And that's a clue about how these groups interacted. The fact that it was so widespread suggests that it was probably being traded across the region.
Makes sense. So they were transporting goods in these pots.
Possibly. There's another interesting connection. The area around Calispera where they made a lot of the Sicili's pottery is also where they find these curious mineral nodules called Camarillus idols.
I've never heard of those. What are they?
They're these naturally formed mineral lumps that people in the past thought looked like little figures or idols. And these Camarillus idols have been found all over the Iberian Peninsula, dating back to the Stone Age.
Wow, so they were pretty popular.
They were. And their widespread distribution suggests that they were valuable trade items. So it's possible that this Cicioc pottery was moving around so much because people were using it to transport these Camarillus idols or other goods that they were trading.
That's a cool connection. So what did these CCL-like pots look like? Were they similar in style to the Argaric pottery?
That's a great question, and it helps us understand these interactions even better. Some of the shapes, like the large storage jars, did have a resemblance to Argaric forms.
So some borrowing of ideas there.
Possibly. But they also found other types that were less common in Argaric contexts, like pots with straight or inward-sloping rims and those shallow, plate-like dishes. And importantly, they didn't find those really distinctive Argaric shapes, like those highly polished, sharply angled bowls.
So a mix of influences then.
Exactly. What about the other pottery types they found?
Yeah, what about those?
The researchers also found several other pottery groups that seem to have much more localized production and limited distribution, staying close to where they were made.
Give me some examples.
Sure, there was Kof, which was mostly found around Cieza, and then there were Cdifcha and Mdifcha, which were only found up in the Altiplano region. These localized types suggest that there were lots of different pottery-making traditions going on in this border area, and many communities were probably just producing their own pottery using whatever clay was easiest to get.
So some self-sufficiency mixed in with the trade and outside influence. Okay, so we've got a picture of Argaric pottery coming in from the south, locally made CCLC pottery traveling around, and then a bunch of other types that stayed close to home. What does all this tell us about the economics and politics of this borderland? How do those pottery patterns translate into real-world interactions?
That's the million-dollar question. By looking at these patterns of pottery production and distribution, we can start to understand how these communities were connected, their economic relationships. And one thing that's really clear is that most of the pottery types were made in one place and didn't travel very far, which suggests that many communities in the border region had fairly localized economies.
So they were pretty self-sufficient.
Yeah, it seems so. They were mostly using local resources to make the things they needed for their daily lives, which makes sense.
It does. But,
Yeah.
like we talked about, there were some exceptions, right? What about the CCL pottery and the Argaric stuff?
Right. Those are the interesting ones. The CC-like pottery is a good example of local production, but with wider circulation, maybe connected to that trade in those Camarella's idols we talked about. It hints at some level of regional exchange networks.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the Argaric pottery?
Now, the Argaric pottery is really unique because it was made using materials from a completely different area. Remember those specific clays from the south? And the fact that it ended up in this border region suggests a much more organized system of production and distribution.
So more than just simple trade.
Exactly. It seems like El Argar had a pretty centralized production system, and they were actively transporting their pottery into this border region. This really highlights their economic development and maybe even a bit of their power, their ability to exert some influence or control over this territory.
It's like they're making their presence known through the pottery.
You could say that. So we've got this influx of Argaric pottery, but how did the people in this border region react to it? Did they just accept everything from El Argar, or did they resist?
Yeah, good question.
Well, the evidence suggests it was a mix of both, and it varied across the borderland. In some places, they found local imitations of Argaric pottery shapes, like those storage jars and bowls with the inward curving rims.
Ah, so they liked the styles but used their own materials.
Exactly. That's a really cool sign of cultural influence and adaptation. They were clearly seeing what El Argar was doing and adopting some of those ideas, but they were also maintaining their own local pottery-making traditions. And it's worth noting that those local copies often had subtle differences compared to the real Argaric stuff.
So not a complete takeover of ideas, but a kind of blending.
That's a good way to put it. And this pattern is even more evident when we look at burial practices.
What did they find there?
Well, the settlements with more Argaric pottery were also more likely to bury their dead within the settlement itself, which is a very typical Argaric custom.
Interesting. So maybe a sign of more complete integration with Argaric culture.
It seems that way. Some areas were really embracing the Argaric social and economic systems, and the pottery is a good indicator of that.
Makes sense. So it sounds like some areas were becoming more like El Argar, while others remained distinct.
Right. And the researchers identified a central part of the border region that they called an interaction zone, where there was a real mix of influences. They found both Argaric and non-Argaric pottery, along with those local copies of Argaric forms, and they even found burials in some sites that didn't have much Argaric pottery.
So more fluid boundary in that central zone.
Exactly. Communities were interacting and coexisting, and there was a real mix of cultural practices. They even found evidence that some sites, like Cerro Marron and Cerro de las Víboras, started showing Argaric influences later in their history, maybe because of the arrival of elites from El Argar, or maybe local leaders were adopting Argaric customs to enhance their own status.
Interesting. So a more gradual spread of influence in those cases. Now, what about that northern area you mentioned, the one that seemed more resistant?
Right. The northern third of the study area, including that El Altiplano region, seem to have kept their distance from El Argar. They found very little Argaric pottery there, and their burial practices were totally different.
So they held on to their own traditions.
It seems that way. There was definitely a resistance to Argaric influence in that area, and the boundary there might have been more clearly defined.
Makes sense. Maybe because of different economic systems, or maybe they were more connected to those Valencian Bronze Age groups.
Those are all good possibilities. So to sum it all up, what we're seeing is that this borderland wasn't one uniform thing. It was a dynamic region with a lot of variation, with some areas being much more integrated with El Argar than others.
So not a single border, but a mosaic of different relationships.
Exactly.
All right, so after all this detective work with ancient pottery, what's the big takeaway? What does this research really teach us?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that studying something as common as pottery can reveal so much about how ancient societies interacted, how they drew boundaries, and how those boundaries were never really static. It gives us a much more complex and nuanced view of the past. We're not just looking at a simple core and periphery model with a powerful center and a passive surrounding area. It was much more dynamic and interesting than that. We see this well-integrated zone in the south, an interaction zone with lots of cultural mixing in the middle, and then that more resistant zone in the north.
It really makes you think about all the stories that are hidden beneath our feet, just waiting to be uncovered. I mean, who would have thought that broken pieces of pottery could tell us so much?
It's amazing, isn't it? And it makes you wonder what future archaeologists will be able to figure out about our own society based on the things we leave behind.
It's a thought-provoking question, for sure. So what's one final thing for our listeners to ponder as they go about their day?
Well, I think this study reminds us that there's so much more to learn about the past than just the big monuments and the fancy artifacts of the elite. There are stories hidden in everyday objects, and those stories can teach us so much about the lives of ordinary people and the complex ways that different societies interacted. So, my challenge to you is to think about what other seemingly mundane things we use today might hold clues for future archaeologists.
That's a great point. It really makes you think about the hidden histories all around us. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about pottery.
Until next time, keep digging.